Hello students, this is the video lecture that I'm doing for JMS 200 about the radio industry. This is the old stuff, old-time radio, radio golden age, that kind of stuff. The Mindich textbook has radio and the music industry mixed together. I am disaggregating those two topics. I think that's the correct word, disaggregating those two topics to do a video lecture just about radio, specifically about radio history. And I was doing this video lecture, I was trying to do this little stand-up while walking on the pathway there. See someone going by, can you? Anyway, but I didn't want to get hit by someone on a skateboard. I thought that might make for an interesting beginning, but probably not pleasant for me. Marconi is the gentleman who gets credit for inventing radio, and I happen to know a great deal about early radio, so I'm going to try and talk quickly to cram in as much as I can. This part of the lecture is covered in the textbook. Anyway, Marconi, Italian guy, his mom is British, part of the Jameson family. The Italian government doesn't want to buy his technology for wireless communication, so he comes to England, gets some fame in England, and then comes to the United States. The New York Herald was a newspaper that commissioned Marconi to use his technology, a way to send wireless messages without the telegraph lines. This is a way to send a wireless message over the air. It's just dots and dashes of Morse code at this time, but it's used to send updates about a yacht race, America's Cup yacht race going on outside Manhattan. There's a boat with one of the Marconi transmitters following the other yachts, sending messages back to shore, where then it's relayed to other people. So if you were standing outside the New York Herald newspaper office, you could get almost like real-time updates about the yacht race. This is also covered in the textbook. The Titanic sinks, and wireless communication could have saved many, many people. At the time, one of the main uses for wireless communication was to communicate with ships, because you obviously couldn't have a physical telegraph cable connecting to a ship. The Titanic sank, a lot of people died, and when it was revealed that if more ships had wireless equipment, then perhaps more people would have been saved. So Congress passes the 1912 Radio Act, which was inspired by the Titanic disaster. And I don't care what James Cameron says, it was entirely possible for Jack and Rose to fit on that piece of floating wood. Horn's department store started selling radio receivers in 1920. A guy named, and I really think you should read this part of the textbook. Frank Conrad, former military guy, uses his equipment. This is in the United States after World War I, who's broadcasting the sounds of records. He could actually play music, not dots and dashes of Morse code. He can actually play music over the air. And a department store starts advertising this, saying, hey, you can come to our department store, hear music over the airwaves, and while you're here, you can buy a kit to make your own radio receiver. This gives the idea to a person from Westinghouse, the Westinghouse Corporation, that, hey, maybe we should start radio stations. How will radio make money? We'll sell the radio receivers. Think about that for a moment. We'll give out free programming. The content is free. Okay, it's like giving out free software. We will make money by selling the hardware, by selling the appliance that consumers need to access that free music. That was the original financial model of broadcasting. Broadcasting refers to sending one signal out to as many people, maybe you don't even know who's going to receive it, as possible. Okay, so if the early version of radio was point to point, sending a message from one place to another message, like on a ship, this is sending a message out into the airwaves so that anyone can listen to it. From the middle part of the 1920s, the financial model of radio begins to change, and advertising comes to radio. This information comes directly from the textbook. AT&T owned a radio station. The call letters were WEAF. WEAF in New York City was owned by AT&T. And the idea was that if you paid the phone company to send a voice message over the phone lines, you could pay the phone company to send a voice message over the airwaves. That was the phone company logic. That's actually the introduction of advertising to radio. And other stations begin to pick up the model, and other people begin creating their own radio stations for a variety of reasons. There were schools, labor unions, churches, some nonprofit groups, but mostly it was by retailers and merchants including a lot of people who sold electrical goods. So everyone is trying to get in on it, and advertising begins to be a way that maybe we can make money from this technology. In the middle part of the 20s, people talk about this as radio chaos, because the government regulations weren't very effective. The government regulations that were developed in 1912 for things like the Titanic, for emergency situations, for maritime use, didn't really work well when people started opening radio stations for other purposes. Believe it or not, this sounds kind of bizarre to the modern mentality. Many radio stations were sharing the same frequency, and I'm going to talk about spectrum here in a moment. So, when you tune your radio dial today, you go to like 90.3, 91.1, 89.5, something like that. Can you imagine if there were multiple stations using the exact same frequency, and they would try and share? You get it Monday, you get it Tuesday, I get it in the afternoon, you get it in the evening. This didn't really work out that well, and it was very, very confusing for listeners. There was also a debate as to who was going to pay for broadcasting. Some of the stations had advertising, other stations didn't. There was this argument that we should have the government pay for it. This is what was done in almost every other country in the world. Okay, almost every other country in the world felt like the power of mass communication made possible by radio was just too the capabilities were too much that you shouldn't leave it in the hands of private enterprise. But we don't do that in the United States. Government funding wasn't going to work in the United States. Do you have people voluntarily send you money out of their wallet? Listener supported voluntary donations. This doesn't work. Public radio is an exception. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But for the most part, this doesn't work. Do you charge people when they buy a radio? You say, okay, you're buying a radio, pay a license fee to the government. The government then collects that license fee. Then the government then gives that money to an organization which provides the radio programming. This is what they did in England. This is how the BBC used to operate. Historically, the BBC and most European countries would get a license fee every time you bought a radio, and then some entity gets that license fee to provide the programming. In the United States, we decided, for whatever reason, that we were going to go with advertising. Okay, so the radio content is free. You don't have to pay for it. You don't have to do a license. There's no government funding. You just have to listen to ads. That's the deal. We decided collectively, it wasn't just one person one time making a decision. We collectively decided, hey, let's let advertisers control the airwaves, thinking that that's going to be a way to provide the most amount of content to people and they don't have to pay for it. Now, I mentioned spectrum already. Let me come back to spectrum allocation. Okay, this graphic shows different industries and different types of uses for the electromagnetic frequency. This is a naturally occurring phenomenon. Okay, the electromagnetic spectrum exists even if we don't do anything. When you send a radio signal, you have to modulate a signal in a certain way so that it operates at a specific frequency. Here we have the frequencies designated by the length of the wavelength. You don't actually see this wavelength, but they can be measured with airwaves. We have maritime radio way over here. We have radio astronomy over here. And in the middle, you have shortwave radio, FM radio, AM radio, mobile phone, satellite communication. They all have to operate on a different frequency to prevent interference with one another. So the government came up with this idea that to prevent the chaotic situation that I was just talking about, we will give individual radio stations a license to broadcast on a specific frequency. That is why radio and television stations need a license to operate, because they are using specific electromagnetic frequencies. You do not need a license to stream online. You don't need a license to create a newspaper. You don't need a license for any other form of media to make movies. You need a license for radio and television over-the-air broadcasting. To resolve the chaotic situation, which I've already talked about, we formed the Federal Radio Commission, which then later became the Federal Communications Commission. Okay, the FRC, Federal Radio Commission, came up with this idea that to operate on a specific electromagnetic frequency, you have to operate in the public interest, convenience, and necessity. Preferential treatment was given for NBC and CBS networks. These were big, giant, nationwide Advertising supported networks. The government said we would give preferential treatment to this, and we will give less positive treatment to labor unions, churches, educational institutions, things like that, because we want to support these organizations. What is the public interest? Okay, so the deal is if you get a radio license or then later a TV license, you have to operate in the public interest. What is the public interest? Well, one way to decide to define it would be the fruits and vegetables. I call this the fruits and vegetables model. The public is best served by giving them good, positive, truthful information to support a democratic society, educational information, stuff about politics. Maybe it's not sexy and fun, but it's good for them so that when people go to vote and choose the next president or vote for the mayor, they have some informed opinion and they know about the world and they hear a diversity of opinions. It is in the best interest to educate people and make them intelligent and make them smart. Like giving a child, if you have a kid, fruits and vegetables, you want them to eat healthy so they grow up to be big and strong so that when you are old, your kids can take care of you. That's the circle of life. Or you could say the public interest is whatever the public is interested in. This is a circular argument, right? Doing with my fingers, a circle. The public interest is whatever the public is interested in. If your kid wants to eat candy and marshmallows for breakfast, give it to them because you're going to have less of an argument and they're going to eat it up. Oreos, Twix, whatever, a big bowl of sugar. Hey, kid, if that's what you want for breakfast, eat up. Is that in the best interest of the child? No, absolutely not. That is not in the best interest of the child. The child will not grow up big and strong and be able to take care of you when you are older. Follow me? In terms of media content, this means give the public whatever they want, whatever kind of celebrity gossip trash they want. You want to talk about reality shows and who married who and did this guy spit on that guy, and you won't believe what just happened on Vanderpump Rules. Whatever, okay? You know, the kind of sleazy, sordid, twisted kind of stuff that fills up the media airwaves. That's what I call the candy for breakfast model of public interest. Just give the public whatever they want. The government decided to go for the candy for breakfast model. I'll repeat, the government decided to go for the candy for breakfast model, meaning the government would rather support non-political, vanilla, plain, non-offensive programming that doesn't have a strong point of view, that simply exists in order to sell advertising. And if that means mindless celebrity gossip or mindless entertainment or violent programming or sexually explicit programming, so be it. That's what the public wants. That's what the public is going to get. Okay. Now, there is something called the public interest mandate for radio and television stations, over the air radio and television stations now, over the air radio and television stations now. So they do have to do some type of educational, government, civic minded programming. I'm not saying that there's no public interest programming, but historically, the pendulum has been more towards candy for breakfast. Now, here is a graphic to show a radio network. This is what a radio network looks like. It's actually a whole bunch of little stations that are located in a local market. We call those the local affiliates. This is a map from the late 30s showing NBC, which at one time had two networks. NBC Blue later became what we now call ABC. So when you talk about a network, it's not really one thing. It's really the local affiliates. The local affiliates have the license. The content for radio and TV is coming from the local affiliate. We might refer to it as one giant network, but it's really a lot of little local things. They would link up at first through telephone lines. Now they use different types of coaxial cables and satellites to share programming. But that's the idea, that the program comes from some big mothership, maybe in New York or LA, goes to the local station, then the local station has the license. That is what's feeding out the content to the local market. A couple of famous programs from the early days of radio. We call this the golden age of radio, from probably 1930s up until about 1950 or so. The image on the far left, I know it's offensive, I apologize, but Amos and Andy, which is discussed in the textbook, Amos and Andy was one of the most, if not the most famous situation comedy on early radio. It was two white performers, Gosden and Corell, not sure how you say his name, would adopt an exaggerated type of blackface dialect where they pretended to be African-American characters. They were white people pretending to be African-American characters. The show is considered highly, highly offensive today, and many people found it offensive even in the 30s and 40s. But it's a complex, I know a lot about Amos and Andy. It's a complex subject because the show also did hire some African-American performers when no one else would. So the issue of representation is kind of complex when it comes to Amos and Andy. Fibber McGee and Molly was another famous situation comedy about sort of a domestic family, and people would come over and visit. The running gag on Fibber McGee and Molly was about a closet, and then Bob Hope was also a very, very famous comedian. Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy. Edgar Bergen is the human, Charlie McCarthy is the ventriloquist dummy. How in the heck was a ventriloquist act one of the most popular things on early radio? Makes no sense. Now we have Abbott and Costello. I'm going to play a little portion here of one of Abbott and Costello's most famous, probably their most famous routine. It's called Who's on First. The joke here is that one guy owns a baseball team. A player named Who, that is his last name, plays first base. And then Abbott, I get confused. Okay, no, Abbott is the guy on the right. Costello is the guy on the left. Okay, yeah. Costello is confused. And anyway, I'm just going to play a portion of it, but I think you can see how this type of linguistic wordplay would work very well on radio when you have no visuals. Abbott and Costello were very famous for their kind of linguistic wordplay, the way they would kind of banter quickly back and forth. And it is funny. It is funny. I admit it is funny, and was a huge influence on the Seinfeld TV show, for those of you who know Seinfeld. So I'm just going to play a little bit of the Who's on First routine. I think it's funny, but you can get a sense of how this type of comedy works even without visuals.
Well, Costello, I'm going to New York with you. You know, Bucky Harris, the Yanks manager, gave me a job as coach for as long as you're on the team.
Look, Abbott, if you're the coach, you must know all the players.
I certainly do.
Well, you know, I never met the guys, so you'll have to tell me their names, and then I'll know who's playing on the team.
Oh, I'll tell you their names, but you know, strange it may seem, they give these ball players nowadays very peculiar names.
You mean funny names?
Strange names, pet names, like Dizzy Dean and...
His brother Daffy.
Daffy Dean.
And their French cousin.
French?
Gouffet.
Gouffet Dean, oh, I see. Well, let's see, we have on the bags, we have who's on first, what's on second, I don't know who's on third.
That's what I want to find out.
I say, who's on first, what's on second, I don't know who's on third.
Are you the manager?
Yes.
You're going to be the coach, too?
Yes.
And you know the fellow's name?
Oh, I should.
Well, then who's on first?
Yes.
I mean the fellow's name.
Who?
The guy on first.
Who?
The first baseman.
Who?
The guy playing
Who
first.
is on first?
I'm asking you who's on first.
That's the man's name.
That's whose name?
Yes.
Well, go ahead and tell me.
That's it.
That's who?
Yes.
You got a first baseman?
Certainly.
Who's playing first?
That's right.
When you pay off the first baseman every month, who gets the money?
Every dollar of it.
All I'm trying to find out is the fellow's name on first base.
Who?
The guy that gets the money.
That's it.
Who gets the money on
He
first
does, every dollar. Sometimes his wife comes down and collects it.
Whose wife?
Yes. What's wrong with that?
Look, all I want to know is when you sign up the first baseman, how does he sign his name to the
Who?
contract? The guy.
Who?
How does he sign his
That's
name?
how he signs it.
Who?
Yes.
All I'm trying to find out is what's the guy's name on first base?
Now, what is on second base?
I'm not asking you who's on second.
Who's on first?
One base at a time.
Well, don't change the players.
I'm not changing nobody.
Take it easy, buddy.
I'm only asking you, who's the guy on first base?
That's right.
Okay.
All right.
What's the guy's name on first base?
No, what is on second?
I'm not asking you who's on second.
Who's on first?
I don't know.
Oh, he's on third. We're not talking about him. Now, let's forget
How did I get on third base?
Why, you mentioned his name.
If I mention a third baseman's name, who did I say is playing third?
No, who's playing first?
What's on first?
What's on second?
I don't know.
He's on third.
There I go, back on third again. Will you stay on third base and don't go off it?
All right, nobody will know.
Now, who's playing third base?
Why do you insist on putting who on third base?
What am I putting on third?
What is on second?
You don't want who on second?
Who is on first?
I don't know. Third base! Look, you got outfield?
Sure.
The left fielder's name.
Why?
I just thought I'd ask.
Well, I just thought I'd tell you.
Then tell me who's playing left field.
Who is playing first?
I'm not... Stay out of the infield! I want to know what's the guy's name in left field.
No, what is on second?
I'm not asking you who's on second.
Who's on first?
I don't know. Third base!
In the 1950s, television gets to be a big deal. We moved from sound and audio only broadcasting to be able to transmit pictures. Radio comedies, the dramas, the soap operas, all that stuff begins to move to the new medium of television. Now radio changes and becomes all about music and the rise of music formats and the rise of the DJ. DJs weren't a big thing before 1950. Then radio takes the form with which we're probably familiar with radio today. Okay. When the scripted content goes to a new medium, radio changes. And I just wanted to throw this in because we are close to the border. There was a whole phenomenon. They called them border blasters, radio stations located over the border in Mexico, maybe just across Texas or California border. They're located in Mexico. If you have a powerful enough transmitter, you can blast to almost all of the United States out of Mexico, and you don't need an FCC license, right? You do not need to be licensed by the US government. You could be licensed by the Mexican government, which historically has had different rules and used to be very, very slack and very loose about who they would give a license to. So a lot of stations would be located over in Mexico, but aimed at the United States and selling ads for the United States. Wolfman Jack was the most famous of these border blaster DJs. He was very, very famous for a few decades. And I even knew who he was when I was growing up in the 70s. Never listened to him, but I knew who he was because he was that famous. Now we have, hopefully I have time to squeeze this into the lecture. There's a couple of radio stations, including ones that I listened to, which are actually located. Okay, they're considered San Diego radio stations. The transmitters over in TJ, including Z90 and 91X, and then 92.5 Magic. For anyone who's ever listened to these radio stations, they have these public service announcements, which are from the Mexican government, and the scripts are written by the Mexican government to satisfy the Mexican government public interest mandate. Okay. I already mentioned the public interest mandate for the United States. Mexican government has its own version of it. These stations are located in Mexico, so they have to play public service announcements for the Mexican government. The English is kind of awkward. It's kind of stilted. It sounds as if it's written by someone for whom English is not their first language. I used to have some former students who worked at these radio stations, and they graciously arranged for me to do one of these public service announcements, which I'm playing just because I find it funny.
Gerardo stole some tuna cans because his family went for days without eating, and he was sentenced to 6 years in prison. But a politician that stole millions of pesos for his and his party benefit was never even processed.
Sorry, Mr. Congressman. There's been a terrible mistake.
Enough of corrupt politicians. No to immunity. Law initiative presented by the Social Encounter Party.
Just to gloss over super quickly, just for the sake of time, radio has evolved a great deal over the years. I'm going to talk about streaming and podcasting in another video lecture. But in the 1960s and afterwards, radios became very, very small. Instead of being big, bulky things, they became very small. The development of the transistor radio, which is the size of a smartphone today or even smaller, then we get a new type of radio where people are carrying around radios, listening to music because you could. It was a very, very small radio. Then FM, which is a different way to transmit. The original model of radio is amplitude modulation. FM is frequency modulation. Music sounds better on FM. Talk is fine on AM. So AM is mostly talk and news now. Music does sound better on FM. However, the AM signal goes farther, okay? So AM sound quality is worse, but the signal goes farther. So depending upon what you want, would you choose an AM or an FM radio station if you were establishing a radio station? Do you want to play music that sounds good, or do you want to reach people as far away as possible? With the Telecommunications Act of 1996, the government begins to deregulate radio, and this has been a continuing trend for the past few decades. There used to be very, very tight limits on the number of radio stations and the number of TV stations that one entity could control. There was fear that one company could control 50% of the radio stations in the United States. The concern went away in 1996, and the government began to allow big, giant corporations to form, which owned hundreds of radio stations. So you get the consolidation of the industry and the homogenation of the industry. A country station in San Diego maybe had a unique format at one time, Now we're in the era where country music stations can play the same format and sound identical, literally have the same programming, or rock, or oldies, or adult contemporary. They can be identical because one company is owning all of these stations, or many of these stations. I think it's kind of unfortunate, but it is the way the industry has been evolving. Anyway, that's it. I know I talked fast, got a lot of information. I'm very passionate. I love this topic, but inshallah, you learned something.